In the vast, frozen silence of Montana's Cabinet Mountains, where the February cold turned survival into a blood sport, wildlife photographer Robert Finch witnessed something few have ever seen before. A bobcat and a Canada lynx, locked in a deadly fight for survival. A brutal clash between two of nature's most elusive predators. These apex predators, who would normally avoid each other at all costs, fought with the fury of creatures that had nothing left to lose. What begins as a battle over prey unfolds into something far deeper. When both animals collapsed from exhaustion and wounds, the photographer was faced with a decision that could change everything. What follows isn't a story of victory or defeat, but something far more astonishing. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. 2 weeks, 14 days of aching cold, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Robert Finch, a wildlife photographer whose passion for nature had been the one constant in his 68 years, felt the icy grip of the Montana wilderness seeping into his very bones. It wasn't just the February chill that gnawed at him. It was the gnawing doubt of far more insidious cold. The severe weather, a relentless siege of wind and snow, had scoured the landscape of life, leaving behind a stark, beautiful, but empty world. The eerie quiet, broken only by the mournful sigh of wind through pine boughs, was beginning to feel less like peace and more like a final, lonely verdict. He sat on the rough-hewn porch of his rented cabin, a thermos of lukewarm coffee cradled in his gloved hands. The steam from his breath plumed in the crystalline air, a fleeting ghost of his own vitality. He had come here, to the remote edge of the Cabinet Mountains, to capture the raw, untamed spirit of the American wild. But more than that, he had come to find a piece of himself he feared was lost. It had been 2 years since his wife, Eleanor, had passed, and the silence in their small Colorado home had become as vast and empty as this frozen landscape. She had been the one who understood his need for the wild, the one who'd packed his thermoses and checked his gear, her quiet belief in him a constant source of warmth. This trip was for her, a pilgrimage to the heart of what they had both loved. But the wilderness was offering no solace. The deer were yarded up in the thickets, the elk had moved to lower elevations, and the wolves, whose haunting calls he yearned to hear, remained spectral and silent. Every day he would trek for miles, his snowshoes sinking into the powdery depths, his expensive camera equipment feeling more like a burden than a tool. The sheer effort of survival in this environment was immense. His fingers, stiff with age and cold, fumbled with lenses. His back ached from the weight of his pack. He felt the sting of failure and the creeping whisper of a question he'd been avoiding. Was he too old for this? Had he confused a lifelong passion with a strength he no longer possessed? If it was this hard for him, with his insulated gear, his stocked pantry, and his roaring wood stove, what must it be for the actual residents of this untamed land? A profound sense of hopelessness began to settle over him, as deep and white as the snowdrifts outside. He was on the verge of packing it in, of admitting defeat and retreating to the hollow comfort of his quiet house. He had one last roll of film, one last day he'd promised himself. The morning of the 16th day dawned brittle and bright, the sun casting long blue shadows across the snow. He felt a familiar pang of disappointment. It was too quiet, too still. He was about to turn back inside when he heard it. It was a sound that didn't belong in the serene tableau, a frantic, violent thrashing, followed by a guttural snarl that tore through the silence. It came from the direction of the frozen lake, about 200 meters from his cabin. Adrenaline, a feeling he hadn't felt in weeks, surged through him. It was a jolt of pure, primal excitement that momentarily erased his fatigue and doubt. Robert moved with a speed that belied his age. He scrambled inside, his movements now precise and economical. He grabbed his primary camera, a trusty Nikon he'd had for decades, and attached the long telephoto lens, his fingers no longer fumbling. He checked the light meter, adjusted the settings from muscle memory, and slung the heavy apparatus around his neck. Forgetting his coffee, forgetting his despair, he plunged into the deep snow, his heart hammering against his ribs. As he drew closer, the sounds grew more distinct, weaving a terrifying narrative. There was the high-pitched squeal of an animal in mortal terror, overlaid with the deeper, angrier sounds of predators. The atmosphere became charged, thick with the scent of pine and the metallic tang of fear. He moved cautiously, using the thick trunks of lodgepole pines as cover, until he reached the edge of the tree line overlooking the lake. He peered through the branches, and the scene that unfolded before him made his breath catch in his throat. His hands, which had been so sure just moments before, froze before he could raise the camera. On the vast, windswept expanse of the ice-covered lake, two of the Northwood's most elusive hunters were locked in a desperate, brutal conflict. A bobcat and a Canada lynx were fighting, not over a carcass, but over a live snowshoe hare. Its white winter coat a stark contrast to the spreading crimson stain on the snow. The hare was wedged in a fissure in the ice, its back legs kicking feebly, its life the prize in a deadly tug-of-war. The bobcat, smaller and more compact, was a whirlwind of focused aggression. Its pale brown spotted coat bristled, its short tail twitched, and its fangs were bared in a silent snarl. It lunged with a reckless violence born of sheer desperation. The lynx, a creature of silver and shadow, was larger, with the characteristically long legs, tufted ears, and enormous snowshoe-like paws of its species. But it was painfully thin, its ribs visible even through its thick, grizzled fur. It held tenaciously to the prey, its own yellow eyes burning with the cold fire of starvation. Claws slashed through the air. The bobcat, quicker and more agile, darted in and out, trying to leverage its lower center of gravity. The lynx used its longer reach and superior weight, trying to pin its smaller adversary. Normally, these two predators, ghosts of the forest, would give each other a wide berth. Their territories might overlap, but direct confrontation was rare. It was a waste of precious energy, an invitation to injury that could mean a slow death in this unforgiving climate. But this wasn't a normal encounter. The deep snows had made hunting nearly impossible. This battle wasn't just about a single meal. It was a fierce, primal struggle for territory, for the right to hunt this barren stretch of land, for the right to see another sunrise. Robert watched, mesmerized and horrified, the photographer in him warring with the naturalist. He should be documenting this, capturing the raw, savage beauty of nature's law. But he couldn't bring himself to press the shutter. He was witnessing a tragedy, a double-edged sword of survival where there could be no true victor. Ultimately, the bobcat's sheer ferocity won the day. It was younger, perhaps, or simply had a deeper well of aggression to draw from. It ducked under a swipe from the lynx's massive paw and sank its teeth into the larger cat's shoulder. The lynx cried out, a sound of pain and outrage, and tried to shake the smaller cat off. The bobcat held on, its body a knot of straining muscle. The fight culminated in a final desperate flurry. The bobcat, with a surge of adrenaline, ripped free and launched itself at the lynx's flank, claws extended. The lynx, weak from hunger and its wounds, finally faltered. It relinquished its grip on the hare and stumbled back, a low growl of defeat rumbling in its chest. The lynx turned to retreat, its proud, tufted head held low. But it managed only a few steps before its long legs buckled. It collapsed onto the ice, a heap of exhausted silver-gray fur, its breath coming in ragged plumes. The bobcat stood over its prize, panting heavily, its sides heaving. It had won. But victory had come at a terrible cost. Robert, through his lens, could now see the deep gash on the bobcat's back, a dark, ragged wound that was welling with blood, staining its beautiful coat. The cat nudged the now-still rabbit, its claim asserted. But it made no move to eat. It took a wavering step, then another, before its own legs gave way. It crumpled to the ice, not 10 feet from its vanquished rival, unable to rise again. The silence that descended upon the lake was more profound than any that had come before. The wind whispered over the ice, swirling snowflakes around the three still forms. The drama was over. The hunter had become the hunted. The victor had become the victim, and the prize lay unclaimed. Robert lowered his camera, the weight of it suddenly unbearable. His heart ached. In that moment, he was no longer Robert Finch, the photographer seeking a perfect shot. He was Bob Finch, the retired veterinarian, the man who had spent 30 years of his life tending to the broken bodies of wild creatures at the rehabilitation center he and Eleanor had founded. He had seen this story play out 1,000 times. A fight for survival that ends in a slow, agonizing death for all involved. "If I leave them here, they'll be carrion before nightfall," he murmured to the unlistening trees. The cold would finish what their claws and teeth had started. A bald eagle was already circling high overhead, a patient, dark speck against the pale blue sky. He couldn't let that happen. The doubt and despair that had plagued him for weeks were burned away by a sudden, fierce clarity of purpose. His age, his aches, his loneliness, they all fell away, replaced by the familiar, powerful instinct to help, to heal. He wasn't too old for this. This was who he was. Getting two injured, hostile predators back to his cabin was a problem that would have seemed insurmountable an hour ago. Now, it was just a series of logistical steps. He hurried back to the cabin, his mind racing. He had a small emergency kit, a remnant of his rehab days that he always brought on these trips. In it were tranquilizer darts and a CO2 pistol, a last resort for dangerous encounters, but perfect for this situation. He also had a small plastic sled he used for hauling gear. He loaded the sled with thick blankets, a first aid kit, and the tranquilizer gun. His movements were steady, his resolve firm. The trek back to the lake felt different this time. He was no longer a passive observer. He was an active participant in the brutal theater of the wild. He approached the scene with extreme caution. Both cats were still down but conscious, their eyes tracking his slow, deliberate movements. The lynx lifted its head, a low hiss escaping its lips, a final, futile warning. The bobcat merely watched, its gaze glassy with pain and shock. Robert loaded a dart, the dose calculated from a quick visual assessment of the lynx's weight. He aimed for the heavy muscle of the thigh, his hand as steady as a surgeon's. The dart flew true, and the lynx flinched, but didn't have the strength to flee. Within minutes, its head lowered, and its breathing deepened into unconsciousness. He repeated the process with the bobcat, his heart twisting at the sight of its grievous wound. Working quickly against the encroaching cold, he first examined the lynx. It was severely malnourished, its body a fragile frame beneath its magnificent coat. It had several deep scratches, but no life-threatening injuries. Starvation was its primary ailment. He carefully wrapped the large cat in a heavy wool blanket, marveling at the size of its paws, perfectly adapted for this snowy world where it had been failing to find purchase. With a great deal of effort, he managed to roll the heavy, limp body onto the sled. Next, he turned to the bobcat. The bite on its back was deep and bleeding sluggishly. It needed to be cleaned and stitched, and soon, or infection would set in. He gently cleaned the worst of the blood away with snow before wrapping the smaller cat in another blanket and placing it on the sled beside its foe. There they lay, two mortal enemies, unconscious and swaddled like infants, sharing a ride away from the brink of death. The journey back was grueling. Robert strained with every step, the sled heavy in the deep snow, his muscles burning, his lungs screaming for air in the thin, cold atmosphere. But he didn't stop. He was fueled by a purpose so strong it felt like a fire in his chest, pushing back the cold, pushing back the years. Back in the warmth of the cabin, the real work began. He set up a makeshift clinic on the floor by the wood stove. He knew he couldn't keep them together when they woke up. His cabin had a small, sturdy storage room attached to the main living space. He laid the tranquilized lynx in there on a bed of blankets, providing it with a bowl of water before closing and barring the solid wood door. He then turned his full attention to the bobcat. He carefully cleaned the wound with antiseptic from his kit, his touch gentle and sure. It was a nasty bite, but the teeth had missed the spine. Using a suturing kit he always kept with him, Eleanor had called it his morbid security blanket, he meticulously stitched the wound closed. He administered a broad-spectrum antibiotic from his veterinary supplies, a single shot that would have to be enough. He bandaged the area as best he could and laid the small cat in a large dog crate he'd brought for storing gear, placing it on the other side of the main room, as far from the storage room as possible. As the tranquilizers wore off, the cabin, once a sanctuary of silence, filled with the sounds of snarling, spitting rage. The bobcat awoke first, thrashing against the bars of its cage, its eyes blazing with wild fury. An hour later, a deep guttural growl echoed from behind the storage room door, followed by the scratch of claws on wood. The air was thick with their mutual hatred, a palpable animosity that seemed to seep into the very logs of the cabin walls. Robert spent the next few days in a state of high alert. He fed them with cuts of venison he had in his freezer, sliding the food into the crate in the storage room on a flat shovel, keeping his hands well clear. For the first week, they barely ate. They would glare at him, and at the empty space that separated them, their hostility a constant draining presence. The cabin felt small, crowded with their wild, untamable spirits. But slowly, painstakingly, a change began. It started with food. The gnawing hunger eventually overrode their fear and anger. They began to eat the offerings ravenously. Robert started to talk to them, his voice low and calm, the way he used to with the frightened animals at the center. He didn't use words of comfort, just a steady, monotonous drone that became part of the cabin's soundscape, a counterpoint to their growls. Weeks passed. The bobcat's wound began to heal, the stitches holding firm. The lynx started to fill out, its coat regaining some of its lustrous sheen. The constant snarling subsided, replaced by a wary, watchful silence. Robert noticed small shifts in their behavior. He would slide the bobcat's food into its crate, and the lynx would stop its pacing in the other room, listening. When he opened the storage room door just enough to slide in the lynx's portion, the bobcat would sit perfectly still in its crate, its ears swiveling, tracking the sounds. They were profoundly aware of each other. Their shared space, their shared captor, their shared experience of being brought back from the edge had forged a strange, invisible link between them. The hatred began to soften at the edges, eroding into a kind of grudging tolerance. Robert decided to risk the next step. He left the door of the dog crate open while he was securely outside, watching through the cabin window. The bobcat hesitantly stepped out, tested the air, and then padded silently to the storage room door. It sniffed at the crack underneath, its stubby tail giving a slight, curious flick. There was no growl from within, only a soft shuffling sound. The shared struggle for survival, which had once made them enemies, now seemed to be the very thing that bonded them. In the controlled safety of the cabin, with full bellies and healing bodies, they were no longer rivals. They were simply survivors. Another week passed, and Robert began letting them both out into the main room of the cabin for short periods, always while he was outside, ready to intervene. He would watch through the window as they maintained a careful distance, occupying opposite ends of the room. They moved around each other with a fluid, cautious grace, two dancers learning the steps of a new and unfamiliar routine. There were no snarls, no posturing, just a quiet, mutual acceptance. One evening, he looked in to see them both sleeping, the lynx stretched out by the cold hearth, the bobcat curled on the rug a dozen feet away. They were at peace. The day finally came when Robert knew it was time. Their strength had returned. The bobcat was lean and muscular, its wound a puckered, hairless scar. The lynx was magnificent, its gaunt frame gone, replaced by the powerful physique of a healthy predator. Keeping them any longer would be a cruelty. He opened the cabin door wide, letting the cold, clean air flood the room. He stood back, his heart a strange mixture of pride and sorrow. He would miss their powerful presence, this bizarre, temporary family he had formed in the heart of the winter wilderness. The two cats looked at the open door, then at each other. There was a moment of silent communication that Robert could only guess at. Then, with a confident stride, the lynx moved toward the opening. The bobcat followed a step behind. They paused on the threshold, two silhouettes against the brilliant white of the snow. Then they were gone, sprinting into the endless forest. But they didn't split apart. For a brief, breathtaking moment, the bobcat and the lynx moved side by side, their steps synchronized as if they were pack-mates, companions of the same kind. There was a strange, impossible harmony in their movement, a silent understanding forged in the crucible of their brutal fight and their shared recovery. They were no longer enemies, nor were they friends. They were something else entirely, something for which Robert had no name. After a few dozen yards, the lynx paused at the edge of the trees. It turned its regal, tufted head and met Robert's gaze across the snowy expanse. Its yellow eyes held no fear, no anger. It was a look of clear, intelligent acknowledgement, a farewell. Tears blurred Robert's vision as he slowly raised his camera. His hands were perfectly steady. He focused the lens, framing the lynx against the dark pines, its breath misting in the frigid air. He pressed the shutter. Click. The sound was small, insignificant against the vast silence. But the image it captured was monumental. It wasn't the action shot of a brutal fight he had once dreamed of. It was a quiet portrait of grace, of an impossible connection, a testament to endurance. It was a picture of the lynx who had survived starvation and defeat. It was a picture of the bobcat, now a blur of motion disappearing into the woods, who had survived a victory that almost killed it. And it was a picture that captured the story of Robert Finch, the man who, in the frozen silence of his own grief, had refused to give up and, in saving two sworn enemies, had rediscovered the enduring, untamable purpose of his own life. He had come to the wilderness to find its spirit, and in the end, he had found his own.